All right. Well, thank you all very much for being here this morning, and sorry for the confusion about the time zone. What I want to talk about today is the question of trust and distrust in science and some of the sources of distrust that I believe we need to address. As many of you know, there have been many books and articles in recent years, including some of my own, dealing with what we could call external sources of distrust in science. And by external, I mean how interested parties have tried to undermine trust in science for political ends, such as the fossil fuel industry casting unwarranted doubt on climate science. But tonight I want to talk about something a little bit different. I want to talk about problems within science that I think constitute a legitimate source of worry that some of our own science may not be reliable and may not, in fact, be worthy of our trust. I want to begin tonight with the story of a single fraudulent scientific paper, what it took to expose that paper, and what it took to get it retracted, and then to consider whether this paper is an isolated example or part of a larger problem in science, and what those of us who are part of the scientific enterprise or who care about the scientific enterprise might do about it. So the paper at issue was authored by three Americans, Williams, Crows, and Munro, and published in the year 2000. The paper claimed to be a comprehensive, independent review of the safety of the herbicide glyphosate. And many of you probably know glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup, the world's most widely used pesticide and one of the most profitable agricultural products ever. The paper was retracted this last December, and when it was retracted, the editors explained why. They had concerns about the authorship, which had been misrepresented, concerns about the validity of the research findings in the context, quote, of the misrepresentation of the author's contributions, and the potential for conflicts of interests associated with this misrepresentation. In particular, the editor concluded that these conflicts of interest had led to bias in evaluating the studies that were being reviewed. This was a review article, and that the authors had discounted studies that had shown evidence of harm from glyphosate. In particular, the editor explained what he called the historical context and influence. He said that the paper had a significant impact on regulatory decision-making regarding glyphosate and Roundup for decades. And given its status as a cornerstone paper in the assessment of glyphosate safety, he wrote, "It is imperative that the integrity of this review article and its conclusions are not compromised. The concerns specified here necessitate this retraction to preserve the scientific integrity of the journal." So in other words, he was saying this paper was a key paper in the regulatory decisions about glyphosate, and therefore, if it was wrong, it had to be retracted, and also that it threatened the integrity of the journal for this paper to be still in print. Now, how did the editor know that this paper was fraudulent? Well, this is where our work came in. The original paper claimed that they were writing an independent, objective, comprehensive review, a kind of meta study of all of the science that had been done on glyphosate until that point. They wrote reviews on the safety of glyphosate and Roundup herbicide that have been conducted by several regulatory agencies and scientific institutions worldwide have concluded that there is no indication of any human health concern. However, despite these reviews, people had raised questions about glyphosate. And so, in response to those questions, the authors said that they had undertaken a new review to, quote, produce a current and comprehensive safety evaluation and risk assessment for humans. The conclusion that they came to was that, quote, under present and expected conditions of use, Roundup herbicide does not pose a health risk to humans. So in other words, pretty unequivocal. They didn't say probably doesn't, we don't think it does. The weight of evidence, they say it does not pose a health risk to humans. However, 17 years later, it was revealed that this paper was not objective, was not independent, and was not comprehensive. In fact, it had treated the available evidence selectively, discounting studies that showed evidence of harm, and most probably because the paper was in fact not written by the men whose names were on the author, but by Monsanto company employees. This was revealed in a group of documents that are known as the Monsanto Papers. These documents were produced in lawsuits, in litigation, which revealed that the paper had been ghostwritten. That is to say, it was not written by the men whose names were on the paper, but the whole idea for the paper, the concept, and the paper itself were largely written by Monsanto employees. This was revealed by internal emails where Monsanto employees were talking to themselves. Around 2015, the International Agency for the Research on Cancer had concluded that glyphosate was probably carcinogenic, and a Monsanto executive, William Haynes, proposed that they would counter the IARC finding with a scientific review of their own. And when talking about this new review that they were proposing, they suggested that the first author would be an academic, and he named 3 possible people, and that they would handle it the same way they had handled an earlier paper. That earlier paper was Williams et al. So, discussing the conclusion of the IARC that glyphosate was probably carcinogenic, the Monsanto executive William Haynes proposed that they counter the IARC with a paper of their own in which they would ghostwrite the exposure, tox, and genotox sections, so in other words, toxicology and genotoxicity. And he says an option would be to add Greem and Kieran Kirkland, so these are academic scientists, to have their names on the publication, but we would be keeping the cost down by us doing the writing, and they would just edit and sign their name, so to speak. Recall, this is how we handled Williams, Crouse, and Munro. So here he says in black and white that the Williams, Crouse, and Munro paper was not actually written by Williams, Crouse, and Munro, but was written by Monsanto. Now, when this information came out in 2017, it was widely discussed and covered in the mass media. In fact, the extensive press coverage presented this evidence as pretty much black and white. So National Public Radio in the United States, CNN, but even Fox News reported that the plaintiffs had shown that Monsanto had ghostwritten this study. Even Robert F. Kennedy, who now defends glyphosate, but at the time served as a lawyer for the litigants, said, quote, Monsanto for 40 years has been following the tobacco playbook, ghostwriting science, buying science. In other words, the evidence seemed clear to a wide range of parties that Monsanto had deliberately manipulated the scientific literature, seeding it with a biased paper in order to claim that glyphosate was safe when in fact there were serious questions about its safety. So how impactful was this paper? And why has it not been retracted, given that this was exposed in 2017, so more than 8 years ago? And given that ghostwriting is acknowledged as a form of scientific misconduct, including by the journal that published the paper. And another question, how widespread are these practices? Well, let's look at the first question first. How impactful was this paper? The answer is very. My research associate, Sasha Korov, and I decided to try to answer this question. How impactful was this paper? And so we traced its influence through 3 domains. The academic literature, asking how is this cited in scientific papers, in policy documents, so how is it used by regulators, and in Wikipedia. So how is this communicated to the public and how does it influence public knowledge? Now, obviously, these are not all the areas in which there could be influence, but we thought these were three important ones where we could obtain systematic data that we could also analyze systematically. So first, if we look at the academic literature, the evidence is unequivocal that the impact of this paper was huge. The paper has over 1,300 citations, according to Google Scholar. This makes it, a very, very highly cited paper. It's in the top 0.1% of all publications mentioning glyphosate. And when we looked at the papers that had cited it, of about 500 papers for which we were able to obtain the full text, only a handful had any caveats at all about the fact that this was ghostwritten, even after 2017 when it was exposed. And there's no drop off in the citations. So you can see here on the screen, here are the citations building up over time. Um, and you see that there's no drop off in the citation. So it's as if the exposure of this paper as ghostwritten has no effect. And you can see also there's a small number of papers that have caveats about this, but almost none. Almost all of these people are citing this paper as if it's completely legitimate with no discussion of the conflicts of interest. And as far as we can tell, it's still being cited even today. We also looked at policy documents where we also found evidence of a large impact. There aren't as many of these, and they're harder to find than scientific papers, but we found 36 policy documents that cited this paper in the context of glyphosate safety, and 29 of them took the paper at face value without any suggestion that maybe there was something problematic. And again, even after 2017. These policy documents included documents from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, so a scientific group, the World Health Organization, Health New Zealand, the Canadian government, and in several lawsuits, including a major lawsuit in front of the International Court of Justice. And just to give you one example of a particularly shocking document, this document shown here on the screen comes from the Canadian Forest Service. And this is a document produced as part of public education where they're answering frequently asked questions about the use of herbicides in Canadian forestry. And one of the questions is, quote, I've read on the internet that glyphosate causes cancer and is an endocrine disruptor. Is that true? And the answer that the Canadian government gives, and this was from 2011, no. Independent scientific review panels conclude that glyphosate is non-carcinogenic, does not cause birth defects, and does not act as an endocrine disruptor. Such reviews conducted by highly qualified professional toxicologists and risk assessment specialists provide the most credible and reliable sources of information. So you see this paper is being cited as credible and reliable because it's published, written by, quote, professional toxicologists, except it isn't. So these government scientists have been hoodwinked by this fraudulent paper. Then we looked at the question of public understanding. And of course, public understanding of science is very difficult to study, but one very important source of information for billions of people around the globe is Wikipedia. And so we found 4 articles in Wikipedia that discussed glyphosate or Roundup. All 4 of these cited this paper. Before 2017, they all cited it as an authoritative safety review. After 2017, something happens. We can see by looking at the editing history of these articles that there were multiple attempts to remove or contextualize this reference, but they're all thwarted by other editors on the grounds that since the paper has not been retracted, it cannot be rejected as invalid. So in other words, this paper had exactly the impact that Monsanto wanted. It influenced the scientific community and the scientific conversation. It influenced regulatory decisions about the safety of glyphosate, and it influenced the public understanding of whether or not this chemical is safe. And as of today, the official position of the US EPA and the European Food Safety Authority is that this chemical is safe to use. But this stands in contrast to the scientific conclusion from IARC, which is a scientific group part of the World Health Organization, that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic, and also to other scientific groups, such as the prestigious Rosamini Institute in Italy, who just last year issued a request to the European Food Safety Agency to reconsider this conclusion. Numerous lawsuits in the United States where courts have found in favor of plaintiffs who are suffering from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which they have attributed to glyphosate exposure. Also in the United States, the Ninth Circuit, so that's the federal court in the West Coast of the United States, overturned the EPA's interim approval of glyphosate on the grounds that the EPA had failed to follow its own guidelines regarding cancer risk and also failed to consider impacts on endangered species. And to my mind, as a historian of science, the most important, a large and growing body of science that has developed even in the last 25 years, including animal studies and in vitro studies regarding other harms that have now been demonstrated in these other studies. These include things like oxidative stress, which has been linked to genotoxicity, effects on gene expression, effects on brain, lung, liver, and kidney function, definitely evidence of endocrine disruption, despite what the Canadian government says, and evidence of links to chronic inflammation, which is in turn linked to cancer, autoimmune diseases, heart disease, and many other ailments. So what we can say then in this story is that this key paper, this paper that has been viewed as a benchmark paper, has now been shown to have been fraudulently authored and misleading in its finding, and therefore has appropriately been retracted. So you might say that science has worked as it should. This paper was exposed, this paper was retracted, and hopefully people will stop citing it. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because first of all, as I've already suggested, we can see that this paper had the impact that Monsanto had wanted it to have. For more than 25 years, this paper had been viewed as the reference on Roundup, and this is exactly what Monsanto wanted. In fact, Monsanto employees had boasted about what they had achieved, that this would be considered, quote, the reference on Roundup and glyphosate safety. And indeed, for 25 years, it has been. And just to give you a little bit more of the texture of this evidence, so this is an email from a Monsanto employee, Lisa Drake, in May of the year 2000. And she writes, the publication by independent experts, haha, they're not really independent, but that's the claim, of the most exhaustive and detailed scientific assessment ever written on glyphosate in the journal Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology was due to the perseverance, hard work, and dedication of the following groups of folks. They deserve significant credit for the stewardship here, since this human health publication on Roundup herbicide and its companion publications will undoubtedly be regarded as the reference on Roundup and glyphosate safety. So she's boasting about how they have basically hoodwinked the public and regulators. And then she goes on to list some of the people who are involved. There's quite a few people here, including Bill Hayden's, who we've already mentioned. But then, oh, sorry. But then look at this. What's going on here? She says, in addition, the environmental and ecotox publication on Roundups, they're going to do a follow-up paper on environmental and ecotoxicity, will be published this summer. The title is Ecotoxicological Risk Assessment for Roundup Herbicide by John P. Giese, Stuart Dobson, and Keith Solomon, and this will be published in the Archives of Environmental Contamination and Toxicology. So we now know there's at least a second paper that falls into this category, plus the third one that I already mentioned. So at least 3 papers now that we know were manipulated by Monsanto. So this story, of course, raises many questions. So I just like to pose a few of them here. Well, one question that some people might have in their minds is this question of, is ghostwriting alone sufficient cause for retraction? And we want to argue that the answer is absolutely yes. If we look at the particular publisher who published this journal, it's clear from their website that all Elsevier journals, and Elsevier is one of the largest science publishers in the world, all Elsevier journals are supposed to follow the so-called COPE guidelines, Committee on Publication Ethics, which say, quote, retraction might be warranted if there is clear evidence of any form of misrepresentation, for example, fictitious authorship, that compromised the reliability of the findings. And journals should address integrity concerns regardless of the age of the article. In other words, ghostwriting is a form of fraud. It's a misrepresentation of who wrote the paper. And to its credit, this journal did, in fact, retract this paper. But we see evidence that it's often viewed as a kind of minor infraction, if it's even really an issue at all. Is it common? Well, it's very hard to know because by its nature, fraud is not something that people admit to. Fraud is something that people generally try to hide. But sadly, we do have evidence to suggest that ghostwriting and particularly financial conflicts of interest are now widespread. And in fact, in many cases, corporate funders review papers before publication and presumably exert influence in that process. So even if the authors actually wrote the paper, if a corporation is funding it, they may exert influence in the study design or the study conclusions. So what is the evidence to support that? Well, in 2004, a scholar, A. Matheson, published an article in which he reviewed the evidence for ghostwriting and conflicts of interest in papers related to glyphosate and Monsanto. And he came up with a list of at least 14 papers with strong evidence of inappropriate influence. At least 3 of these papers were clearly ghostwritten, and almost all of them had corporate funding, which in most cases, was not fully disclosed. So in other words, at minimum, there's the potential for conflict of interest because these papers are being funded by the company that makes the chemical. And in at least 3 of these cases, and probably more, these papers were ghostwritten. Now, in addition, at the University of Chicago Law School, a law student named Jason Bateman, a Canadian law student, has just this week published a preprint of an article dealing with this paper by Greem et al. That's the one here in the middle, this big arrow here. So this is an extremely important paper because it dealt with the question of whether there was any evidence of tumor formation from mice that had been exposed to glyphosate. And there was, in fact, an extremely important paper that showed evidence that, yes, mice that were exposed to glyphosate did develop tumors. But this paper by Greem et al. Explained that finding away. They wrote a paper in which they reviewed all the animal studies and claimed that this particular animal study had been compromised by viral contamination. But in fact, there was no evidence whatsoever of viral contamination. It was just kind of thrown out there in order to discount this important evidence. And Bateman shows that despite the fact that there was no evidence for that finding, this paper, the Greem et al., has been widely cited in defense of glyphosate, including in lawsuits where judges have generally accepted the claim uncritically because they weren't in a position to know that this paper was ghostwritten. And evidence suggests that these are not isolated examples. So we now have 3 examples for sure where we can prove that these papers were ghostwritten. We have one of them has been retracted. But what about in the rest of science? Maybe this is just an anomaly associated with this particular chemical, or maybe it's an anomaly associated with a particularly dreadful corporation. Well, unfortunately, the evidence doesn't allow us to simply come to that conclusion. Already in the 2000s, the British psychiatrist David Healy had looked at the question of ghostwriting in biomedicine and testified in a hearing in the British Parliament that in his estimate, as many as half of all papers dealing with drug and medical device efficacy were ghostwritten. Most of this evidence comes from lawsuits. And I think this helps to explain why most scientists don't know about it. Most scientists, we're trying to do science. We're not tracking lawsuits. So we wouldn't really know that these that this evidence is coming out. But he discussed at least three examples that had been documented. So one came from the late 1990s, where the big pharma company Park Davis, who I should just say makes lots of good products. So I think we can't just discount this as, Monsanto is a dreadful company making dreadful things. Park Davis makes a lot of good drugs. Um, in fact, full disclosure, my own dog takes the drug that I'm about to discuss, gabapentin. So this drug was developed as an anticonvulsant, but Park Davis had evidence that it could be effective for other things as well. So they undertook what they called a publication campaign designed to encourage the use of this drug beyond the scope of its license. So in other words, beyond the scientific evidence. They planned 24 scientific papers, of which 11 were written and appeared in the target medical journals, including prestigious journals like the British Medical Journal. Not one of these papers disclosed Park Davis's role in developing and writing these papers, and only two even mentioned financial support of any kind. A few years after that, you may remember the case of Vioxx, a painkiller developed by Merck, another very important pharmaceutical company. Merck heavily promoted and marketed Vioxx despite evidence that it was in fact causing fatal heart attacks. A paper published in the Annals of Internal Medicine, so again, a very prestigious, very important scientific journal, omitted some participants' deaths. In other words, data showing that people had died was removed from the paper before it was published. The paper's author later confessed that Merck had, quote, designed the trial, paid for the trial, ran the trial, and only asked him after the fact to be its author. So, in other words, this scientist had nothing to do with the scientific trial, but he put his name on his paper. That, again, is a form of fraudulent practice. And in 2009, the pharmaceutical giant Wyeth published 26 papers in medical journals on hormone replacement therapy. At the time, Wyeth was earning nearly $2 billion in a year from hormone replacement therapies. And these papers were all papers to the effect of saying that hormone replacement therapy was safe and effective and downplaying any evidence of harms or risks. So what we see here is that even if some of the papers may have been legitimate, even if some of these drugs may have worked well, there's a distortion of the scientific conversation by the deliberate attempt to manipulate the scientific literature by the companies manufacturing and profiting from these drugs. The Canadian sociologist Sergio Sismondo has said it's not just ghost writing, it's actually a bigger problem, which he calls ghost management. That these companies aren't just writing individual papers, but they're engaged in systematic efforts to manage and shape the scientific literature in ways that distort the scientific conversation, distort our understanding of the truth of these matters in order to advance corporate interests. So one question we're left with then is, why was the Williams paper not retracted sooner? And the short answer is because no one had asked. After Sasha and I published our paper, we then wrote to the journal asking for this paper to be retracted. They took a few months to look into it, and then they did retract it. But when we asked them, why did this not happen sooner? The editor told us, because until you asked, no one had brought this to our attention. So that suggests to us that there is a bigger problem here. It's not just that this one paper was ghostwritten or that this one paper slipped through the cracks. It's that the scientific community has not taken this problem very seriously and doesn't have mechanisms in place to identify these sorts of practices, to sanction them, and to retract papers that are written under these kinds of circumstances. Two of the other ghostwritten papers that I referred to in my earlier slide were already flagged by the Center for Biodiversity. They filed a complaint some years ago about these two other papers published in 2015. The journal reviewed the matter, but all they did was to issue an expression of concern. Now, in fact, some of these journals are themselves the problem. So in some cases, honest journals may miss things like the Annals of Internal Medicine is a very excellent journal. Presumably, the editors didn't know what was going on, but in some cases, these journals themselves are problematic. So, one of the key journals involved, the journal in which the Williams et al. Paper was originally published, is a journal called Regulatory Toxicology and Pharmacology. This journal has a very checkered history. It was founded in 1981 by two scientists, Fred Coulston and Albert Cobier. Coulston, for many years, ran a major laboratory which experimented on chimpanzees. It was the subject of many complaints about unethical treatment of primates, and eventually it was shut down because of allegations or findings of misconduct. From 1980 to 2003, the editor of the journal was a man named Joe Batagori, who ran the journal while he was receiving payments as a consultant to the tobacco industry. We know that in 1991, he was paid $30,000 by the Tobacco Institute to write an article dismissing the risks of secondhand smoke, and then publish that article in his own journal. So two conflicts of interest, one taking money from the Tobacco Institute, actually three, two, publishing a paper that was clearly biased in favor of tobacco, and then three, publishing it in his own journal, so presumably without appropriate independent peer review. So this is the journal that in 2000 published the Williams et al. Paper. In 2006, Gorey's role and his relations to the tobacco industry was exposed, but the journal continued to publish. And in 2013, some documents got exposed that really showed that this journal had been almost entirely captured by the tobacco industry. In 2019, it got a new editor, Martin Vanderberg, and he is the person who has now retracted the Williams paper. And as I said, what he said about that was that he had lost confidence in the results and conclusions of the Williams et al. Article and believes that the retraction of the article is necessary to maintain the integrity of the journal. But that raises some pretty big questions about whether or not this journal actually has integrity to maintain. And then there are universities. So this brings us a little closer to home. It seems to me that universities have not taken this issue very seriously either. Both Williams and Giese, so Williams is the glyphosate guy, Giese is the PFAS guy, they were both investigated by their universities, but neither man was sanctioned. Williams' behavior was reviewed in 2017 by the New York Medical College, where he taught, who concluded that there was, quote, no evidence that he had violated school policies. And Giese was investigated by his university, the University of Saskatchewan, who told the Canadian Broadcasting Company in 2018 that there were, quote, no apparent grounds for a review of Giese's conduct. So it seems to me the evidence is that most universities are simply turning a blind eye to these practices and not wanting to get involved. And then we come to Jeffrey Epstein, and this is a little bit of a jump, and I'm going to jump over some pretty big ground because I want to make a bigger point. And the bigger point has to do with trust in science. So as I said at the outset, a lot of my work has really been about defending science, particularly defending climate science from what I believe are unwarranted attacks by the fossil fuel industry. And I wrote a whole book, Why Trust Science, laying out the practices within the scientific community that work to maintain the integrity of scientific work. But it's hard to defend science when you know that a significant portion of scientific work is being corrupted either by corporate or other parties. And this brings us to Jeffrey Epstein. And so I wanted to say a few words about this, particularly because it influences and affects my own university. So as you all know, there's been tremendous attention in the United States in the last year or so to the so-called Epstein files. These papers document the extensive relationships that Epstein had with influential people around the country and the globe, including many very prominent scientists, and including prominent scientists at some of America's leading universities, including Harvard and MIT. And it's well established, it's been known for some time that Epstein gave many millions of dollars to prominent American scientists, including more than $9 million to scientists at Harvard. Now, to its credit, Harvard stopped taking Epstein money after 2008, when it became aware of the fact that he was, in fact, a convicted sex offender. But many universities to continue to accept his gifts even after he had been convicted. And very disturbingly, individual scientists at Harvard tried to pressure the administration to allow them to continue to take his money against university policies. And these included some very famous scientists like my colleague George Church, Martin Novak, and others. Now, the important point, I think, for us to understand is that this money, these gifts, these monies were not just gifts. The idea that philanthropists just give money out of the goodness of their heart, well, there may be cases where that's true, but that's clearly not what's happening here. These were projects that he was funding projects that he, a convicted sex offender with no scientific training, he didn't even go to college, just found interesting. And many of these projects had a kind of neo-eugenic slant. That is to say, they were very focused on the genetic basis of things like intelligence and behavior. And so, in this regard, I would argue that Epstein distorted the scientific landscape, funding projects not based on their objective intellectual merits, but on the appeal they had to him as an individual. And he picked out scientists who were doing work that he personally liked, even if that work was perhaps not necessarily the best or most valid science. The Epstein files, like the Monsanto papers, document a variety of forms of corruption. Links to prominent scientists and prestigious universities have garnered a lot of attention, and I think that's legitimate. I don't think it's just gossip mongering because fundamentally this is about trust. Should the American people and people around the world trust science? Should we trust scientists? Should we trust Harvard and MIT and other institutions that helped this criminal to whitewash his reputation and permitted him to move in these very elite circles without question and permitted him to have access to buildings where young women were studying? So, my argument here, and obviously I've had to pack a lot into a short amount of time, but my argument is that we academics, we scientists, we in universities have to take these problems seriously. If we are to rebuild public trust in science, if we are to ask people to trust the work that we do, we have to ensure that our science is, in fact, trustworthy. And I think the evidence shows that in important areas that really affect human health, areas, things to do with medicine, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, and also areas that have to do with how we understand who we are and the role of our genes in our lives. Um, we've allowed some pretty unsavory practices to proliferate. So, in short, what I'm arguing here is that we have quite a bit of work to do. And with that, I'll be happy to take some questions.
Yeah, Naomi, hello, how are you?
Hi, so good to see you. Sorry about the confusion earlier.
No problem, no problem. Luckily, I came back, came back to office early enough to catch you. Very interesting talk. I think that about your in-depth study. Now, one question I have is, I mean, I mentioned this to you. You talk about ghostwriting, right? Ghostwriting, and but today we don't have. I mean, we have ghostwriting, but also we have also AI writing.
Yes,
And
yeah.
what do you say about that?
Well, I think, yeah, and I thought obviously we talked about including AI in this talk, and I decided it was too much, but we can talk about it now. So I think there's two things. One thing has to do with honesty and disclosure. So I think that AI is a powerful tool, and particularly because scientific literature is now largely published in English, and English is not the first language of most people on the planet. I think that to use AI to help with English is a perfectly legitimate thing to do so long as it's disclosed. And so I think as long as the authors say we used AI to help us, communicate clearly, I don't think there's a problem with that. If people begin to use AI to actually analyze the data and don't check the data, then I think we begin to have problems because we know that AI can be very reliable in some cases, but not so reliable in others. And reliability has to be at the core of all scientific work. So I think it's about what we're using it for, and also that we make sure that we fully disclose whatever those uses are.
Yeah, I mean, there are some universities or some places now have the rule that you could publish things uh, by using AI if you could prove that you have been using the AI to ask the same thing on over than 10 or 20 times, and then that is your work. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. So, in other words, to do it repeatedly to make sure that the answer is consistent. So
Not
it
so
does.
much that, but means that the results you have really come through your discussion or your questioning the AI. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point because we know that, AI, like opinion polls, depending on how you pose the question, you can get very different answers. And
Mhm.
actually, just 2 days ago, I'm working on a paper with a colleague, and just to see what AI would say, I posed to AI the question that we are attempting to answer in this paper, and AI agreed with me. I thought, okay, that's good. But then my colleague posed the same question, but flipping the null hypothesis, in a sense, inviting AI to disagree with us, and he got a very, very different answer. So I think we have to be very mindful about that as well. And I
Mm.
think the idea of trying to develop policies to work through that, I think, is a really good idea because we won't get it right immediately. It will take time to figure this out. And of course, AI is changing even as we use it. But I think the idea of trying to develop coherent policies and consistent policies, I think that makes sense.
Thank you, Naomi. Any question from the audience? I mean, the you could ask Oriscus anything, you know. I have not introduced you at the beginning because I came late. Naomi, I think you are still consider yourself a geologist, right? You have this fantastic
Yes.
scientific background. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I would say I still consider myself an earth scientist. I don't do active geological research anymore, but I still continue to publish scientific papers from time to time with colleagues. I've
Mm.
published some papers on the statistics of climate change. So, yes, I still consider myself a natural scientist as well as a historian of science.
Yeah, you're a very unique blend of different things, truly interdisciplinary. Question from the audience. I think we still have some time. I think you're in a hurry. Go back to, I don't know where you are going to for dinner or for something.
No, to go to sleep. It's nearly my bedtime here, but I can definitely
Okay.
answer a few questions.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, about that. Question from the
Yeah.
audience. I mean, you could raise your hand or just ask. Now, you can ask in Chinese. I could translate for you. I'm not sure because now we may even understand Chinese.
No, I wish I did. That would be very nice. Or they could, if it's easier to write the question, they could write the question in the chat.
Yeah. Because you put your case in a very specific history, historical study, and if there are no other question, maybe I ask you another one.
Sure.
The so besides the I mean, of course, you pay a lot of attention to a cigarette and but how about other things like the drugs? I mean, like today's I mean, the policy today. You mentioned also some important people like Kennedy. You know that. So what's your outlook?
Well, we obviously are in a very difficult situation in right now in the United States for at least two reasons. Well, many reasons, but at least two relevant to this talk. So the first has to do with Robert Kennedy and his role in the Department of Health and Human Services. So this is a man who previously had been a lawyer on behalf of people who claimed to have been hurt by glyphosate. But now, as part of the Trump administration, he's not only defending the safety, but he's trying to strip people of their legal rights to challenge uh, this pesticide in court. So the Trump administration, so Bayer, who now owns Monsanto, has filed an appeal with the Supreme Court, which the Supreme Court has agreed to hear and will hear next month, claiming that they should be protected from any lawsuits regarding glyphosate because the EPA had approved this. And we're arguing, and I'm part of a group that's filing a brief on this case, we're arguing that that's ridiculous for two reasons. First of all, that's not what the law in America has ever been. We've always allowed for people to have legal redress if they think a regulatory agency has made a mistake, dropped the ball. We know that science can evolve and change, so an agency could make a decision in good faith which turns out to be a wrong decision, and people may have got hurt, and those people deserve legal redress. But also in this case, we're talking about fraud. We're talking about a company deliberately perpetrating a fraud against the regulators and against the American people. So we would argue that in no way, shape, or form should that company be rewarded for that fraud. But the Trump administration is supporting Bayer in this claim, and Robert Kennedy is supporting them in this claim. So this is very troubling and worrisome. And then you may also have heard that President Trump has invoked the Defense Production Act, claiming that glyphosate is essential for national security. And this would give another layer of legal protection to this chemical. And the fact that they are going to these incredible lengths to protect this chemical, um, well, I just feel like, wow, that's pretty extreme. Defense Production Act, as far as I know, has never been invoked before to defend an herbicide. And it seems very peculiar and unprecedented. And it makes me really worry about the health and safety, not just of the American people, but of the billions of people around the globe who are exposed to this chemical, because this is the most widely used herbicide on Earth. Studies have shown that it's in bread, it's in breakfast cereals, it's in beer, and studies have shown that it's in us, that it's in our tissues and our bloodstream, and even in mother's milk. And so this, it seems to me, is a source, should be a source of quite significant concern.
I'm going to say that a battle you have been fighting for the last 20 some years is still going on.
Yes. And
And
of course, the other piece of it is the regulatory agency, right? That
mm,
the regulatory agencies, we depend on those agencies to depend on science. And if we don't
mm.
have good science, if we don't have uncorrupted science, then the regulators can't do their job even when they want to.
Yeah, there's a question from okay, there's someone Inola, can you read this from your screen?
Yes, I can. She wants to ask me about using AI.
Mm.
So, how the strategy for using AI if we have so many assignments that we are overwhelmed? We just want to make sure time to do the assignments, and many scientists are using it for international journals. I think I don't know how that could be. Well, okay. The first thing is if you have too much work to do, then you need to talk to your professors, right? The solution to too much work is not to take the shortcut and use AI, because if you use AI, you won't learn. Because learning isn't just about knowing the facts or writing down answers on a piece of paper. Learning is about the process where you read, you study, you look at data, you think about it, and you absorb information in that process, and then you understand it and you retain it. If you just use AI and then you cut and paste that into a paper, you will not learn. And so your education will not be what it should be. So if you're suffering because your professors are expecting or demanding too much, I would really encourage you to make an appointment with your professors and talk about workload management. Every generation of students faces this issue. You're not alone. I faced it when I was in college. We all struggle to get all the work done that we need to get done. And there are strategies for time management that are effective and can help you learn, but AI won't be that strategy.
Yeah, yeah.
But what do
Right.
you think? Let me turn that to you. You must have some opinions about that.
You mean asking me or
Mm,
asking
yeah, yeah,
I mean we are, or at least I am of the old generation that you learn things by reading books, right? Trying to after reading papers and you think about it whether you understand it or not, and then you come to your own conclusion. And today, the problem is that the new generation, the student today, the young students, they it's so easy, to get the answer, uh,
yeah,
and they think that is natural. So
yeah,
their brain, I think that I think that the brain structure from now on will be very, very different. That they're not
yeah,
using that. Also, I have a question to some people say that, okay, they say, okay, you say AI is fine as long as you can tell whether it's right or wrong, right? You can make your own judgment. On the other hand, I said that if you don't know the subject, how can you judge it? Yeah.
Right.
Okay, judge you. You have to learn, you have the basis, right, to tell the right or wrong. So
Yeah.
that's very contradictory, I think, today. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think people get confused because they think learning is about the answers. And it is true that in many cases, not all, in many cases, AI can give you the answer, although it can also give you completely nonsense. Um, but it's not just about the answer, it's about the process by which you get that answer. And you have to understand that process because if you don't, then you're not in a position to judge whether AI is giving you good information or hogwash. And I'll just give one example out of history that I really love. So, 100 years ago, there was a very great and famous oceanographer by the name of Harold Sverdrup. He wrote the textbook that defined the field for the better part of the 20th century. It was called The Oceans. And he was one of the people who really created modern oceanography and was a hero to many, many scientists. But one of the things he used to say to his own scientists that sometimes annoyed them was that they all had to go to sea and they all had to collect their own data. And not all the scientists agreed with them. A lot of the scientists thought it was a waste of time to go to sea. You could get a graduate student to go collect the data. They got seasick. They didn't want to be away from home. So why did Sverdrup insist? He said, because if you don't collect the data yourself, you will have no idea whether that data is any good. And you will have no idea what the factors are that determine whether you get good data or not. And he was particularly thinking about being on a ship where it's freezing cold and the ship's knocking around. But I think you can generalize that to say more broadly, it's not easy to do scientific experiments. It's not easy to collect good data. Laboratory mice do get contaminated, and how do you know whether or not your results are valid or they've been contaminated or there's some artifact? There's no way to know that unless you actually do the work yourself. And that's why it's so important for students not just to read the books, which absolutely I agree with, but also to get experience in the lab, to go out into the field, to collect rocks, to collect samples, because there's so much that goes into that. And if you don't understand that, you will never be in a position to judge whether scientific claims are right or wrong.
Yeah, I mean the approach and the attitude, as you said, must be like that. On our hand, they say for some people who are at the beginning of a topic, they because that discipline just starting that, so you could correct something, go somewhere just a little bit, and you could understand a lot. But today, that discipline have grown to be so big, it's not possible, to do things like that anymore. So that's the problem. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So it looks like we have another question.
Right. Come, let me
Um,
see.
I think it's the same student. Yeah. So she was shocked by the Epstein files. How do we know hoax or no? Well, it's a very good question. And we're increasingly in a period where it's going to become more and more difficult to know. And, personally, as a historian, it's one reason I go to archives, right? It's one reason I still go and find the paper copies, because at least for now, it's not that easy to make fake paper copies of things. So I think that one of the challenges we have to face in the next few years is how are we going to determine whether or not documents or images are real? And of course, the computer scientists have ideas for things like watermarking images, but I think we do need to think a lot harder about that. And we have to realize that, deep fakes, fake videos, fake images, these are now increasingly common. And so we have to figure out a way how to be skeptical without just becoming completely, having a corrosive disbelief in everything. And again, this is where I think universities have to play a role. Universities have to be willing to invest time and money and effort into thinking through these problems and thinking, what role could we play to help people figure out what's real and what's a hoax?
Very good. Naomi, you should come back to Taiwan sometime in near future.
I would
Let me
like to
know.
come back to Taiwan.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
missed you.
yeah.
All right. Well,
Yeah, by
thank
the
you
way,
so
you
much.
still have the tea you brought back from Taiwan last
No,
time?
I've drank it all, of course. Yeah, that tea
Yeah.
was the best tea ever. So,
Okay. So next time I will send you all the tea from Taiwan.
all right, that would be excellent. Yeah,
Okay,
I
good. Thank
happy
you
to.
so much. I mean, that
You're
we take up
welcome.
much of your time. It's time for actually an hour already, so Thank
Yeah,
you so much. That I think that the much of you said would be very interesting for other people to listen to too. Yeah.
great.
And
Well, thank you as well. It's been a pleasure seeing you again and speaking with the students. And I hope everyone, I hope you have a continue the conversation
right,
because these
right.
are big and important questions.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I
Good
mean,
night.
yeah, good
Take
night.
care or good
Yeah, good
morning.
night. Yeah.
Bye.
大家谢谢。